I am Ambra Vestri. I am, a PhD in molecular biotechnology, and I have a fellowship at the Institute of Applied Sciences and Intelligence System of the National Research Council of Italy. I work on the Nano-photonic smart material team of the Institute, and this team is headed by Dr. Lucia Petti. And I work together with Dr. Valentina Marchesano that collaborated with me for this presentation. That is a general introduction on the strategies of functionalization of gold plasmonic material for sensing application. So, before starting, before starting, a brief introduction on our institute and our team. Our institute, is located in Pozzuoli, Naples province in the south of Italy, and the main research area of our team is based on nanotechnology and smart materials for composite devices. In particular, we are interested in the design, the development, the fabrication, and the characterization of two types of materials that are photopolymers, to integrate also in optoelectronics devices, and plasmonic micro and nanostructures to use for different applications, in particular for SERS and LSPR analysis. So our my colleagues have already shown you different aspects of our research work. And now I'm going to complete this picture, giving you some information about the functionalization strategy of plasmonic substrates for biosensing application. So briefly, the summary of this presentation. First of all, we are going to discuss what a biosensor is. So we are going to see its components and its application, its utility. Then we are going to see some examples of bioreceptors that are used as components of biosensors. Just a couple of words concerning biosensors based on plasmon resonance and plasmon sensors realized using gold as noble metal. And then we are going to approach the real core of the lecture, that is the surface functionalization of gold substrates to realize plasmonic sensor, discussing advantages and main issues, and most importantly, considering some interesting examples reported in literature. So, what is a biosensor? A biosensor is a type of sensor, and a sensor, generally speaking, is an analytical device used for the detection of a chemical substance, usually called analyte. A typical sensor contains two principal functional units: a receptor and a signal transducer. The receptor unit is responsible for the selective recognition of the analyte of interest. And when the receptor is a biological molecule, the system is called biosensor because of the presence of a bioreceptor. Then the signal transducer. The signal transducer is the unit that translates the selective recognition of the analyte, the biorecognition event, into a useful physical signal. This signal is usually proportional to the amount of analyte bound by the bioreceptor. The types of transducer can be different. for example, electrochemical, optical, or mechanical. Anyway, today we are going to consider only the sensor based on plasmonic resonance. Finally, in a biosensor system, we have also a detector that can amplify and convert, display, record the output signal. So, okay, bioreceptors. So bioreceptor is the first main component of a biosensor. Honestly, a really huge variety of biological materials are reported in literature as bioreceptors, from proteins to nucleic acids, from viruses to whole cells. Anyway, generally speaking, a bioreceptor has to be chosen considering three important aspects. First of all, its specificity, because the bioreceptor should recognize only the analyte of interest. Its affinity, the binding affinity toward the analyte of interest, and also its stability, in particular its stability during and after the immobilization on the sensor surface. Now we are going to briefly introduce only a few examples of bioreceptors that are particularly noted or interesting or innovative for these purposes. First of all, antibodies. Antibodies is the most famous and commonly used biological recognition elements, the most used in biosensing. Antibodies are proteins and they are also called immunoglobulins. They have a Y shape and they are produced by the immune system of mammals to neutralize, to recognize and neutralize foreign objects, foreign substances. So they can be used as bioreceptors because they can bind with a high affinity and high specificity a particular substance. In particular, the arms of the Y contains two regions called FAB regions, and they are the sites capable of the specific binding, while the SC region is the tail of the antibody and is highly conserved. A biosensor can be realized using both the whole antibody or antibody fragments, and in these cases the biosensor is also called immunosensor. Another important example of bioreceptor is aptamers. Aptamers are also frequently used as biorecognition elements in biosensing. They are synthetic nucleic acid, that means in few words DNA and RNA, and they are single-stranded molecule, but they need to be folded in two-dimensional or three-dimensional structures in order to bind specifically the target and with high selectivity the target molecule. They are small molecules, smaller than antibodies, and in general they are also easier to modify. Anyway, the selection processes used to identify aptamer sequences with high affinity for a target of interest is a process quite complicated and time-consuming. The other two examples of bioreceptors are quite innovative, and they are affinity peptides and bacteriophages. So the peptides, these peptides are able to bind a specific target with high affinity. They are small, easy to produce by synthetic strategy, and also quite easy to manipulate. Anyway, also in this case, it's necessary a complex screening process to identify high affinity sequences of interest, high affinity peptides of interest. So the last one, bacteriophages, they are viruses that infect and replicate within bacteria. But they are safe to use as bioreceptors because they are able to infect only these unicellular organisms. Of course, they are quite big, very big elements in comparison to other molecular bioreceptors, and they can be used only for bacterial detection because they can bind specifically only their host cells. Anyway, they show some advantages. They show excellent affinity and selectivity properties, and they are also really stable also in harsh condition. And generally speaking, their production is quite simple and not expensive. Okay, as anticipated, we are going to consider only sensors based on plasmonic resonance as a signal transduction. And just a few words on this topic because the subject has been already discussed previously, for example, by Dr. Massimo Rippa. So briefly, plasmonic sensors are based on generation of surface plasmons in nanostructured metals, usually noble metals. And these surface plasmons are collective oscillations of the free electrons at the surface of the nanostructured metals, and are generated in response to incident waves. Broadly speaking, plasmonic sensors exploit the spectral property of the plasmon in order to transduce the sensing signal, and plasmon-based biosensors allow a label-free detection of the analyte, and they can be divided into two main categories. The first one aims to detect variation in the spectral frequencies associated with the surface plasmon resonance, and typical examples are SPR and LSPR, while the second category aims to magnify the intensity of the signal associated with the analyte presence. And an example is surface enhanced Raman spectroscopy, SERS. So different metals can be used to realize plasmonic materials. Anyway, gold still remains the most promising and used metals in plasmonic biosensing. And for this reason, later we are going to discuss only linkage strategy to gold surfaces. So why gold for plasmonic biosensing? Because gold exhibits good plasmonic properties for wavelengths in the visible near infrared region, in particular for wavelengths higher than 560, 480 nanometers. It's an inert metal. Its resistance against air oxidation. It's quite easy to manipulate using different fabrication techniques. to produce nanoparticles and nanostructured surfaces. And moreover, its high reactivity with tiles allows to realize easy and stable functionalization. So we are going to discuss the importance of gold plasmonic substrate functionalization for biosensing purposes. So in general, surface modification, In general, surface modification is used to provide new or improvement properties to the material of interest. Concerning biosensors, the surface functionalization is essential for different reasons. First of all, surface functionalization allows to give selectivity to the plasmonic sensor system. And this is really important because in real samples, usually we find other substances, other contaminants other than the analyte of interest. So a sensor should be able to detect specifically only the analyte of interest in order to avoid purification and extraction steps that are very limiting, in particular when the analyte is in low concentration. As mentioned before, the selectivity of a biosensor is achieved integrating and mobilizing a bioreceptor onto the sensor surface. The bioreceptor immobilization is also important for the sensitivity of the system. Indeed, it's well known that the plasmonic field decays rapidly as a function of the distance from the plasmonic surface. So it's really important the presence of a bioreceptor that can capture with really high affinity the analyte dispersed in solution, dragging, concentrating it close to the sensor surface. Moreover, for the analysis of complex biological samples, such as serum or saliva, it's possible and frequent, unfortunately, that the large variety of molecules present in the sample matrix can interfere with the sensor surface in a non-specific way. So they can absorb in a non-specific way to the sensor surface. And for this reason, functionalization strategies should be also consider non-falling properties in order to minimize this drawback. So, when we choose a functionalization strategy to realize a plasmonic biosensor, it's important to consider that the sensor signal is proportional to the efficiency of the biorecognition event occurring on the sensor surface. So in order to maximize this biorecognition efficiency, we should choose, first of all, a bioreceptor able to bind with high specificity and high affinity the analyte of interest. And then we should choose a coupling strategy that allows a stable biomodification of the sensor surface, a coupling strategy, a functionalization strategy that allows to maximize the number of active bioreceptors onto the sensor surface, preserving at the same time the native activity of the bioreceptor. And we should also remember that the distance between the sensor surface and the analyte plays a very important role for the sensitivity of the detection. So the thickness of the functionalization layer must also be considered. And as mentioned before, also the anti-fouling properties of the functionalization strategy are important in order to minimize non-specific signals. So to conclude this lecture, we are going to briefly discuss some example of functionalizations reported in literature for the development of plasmonic biosensor. This first strategy, in my opinion, is very attractive because it uses a small, simple, and cheap molecule called carbon disulfide to realize an easy and efficient bioimmobilization. Carbon disulfide contains sulfur that can strongly bind gold, and carbon disulfide can also spontaneously react with amines, forming stable dithiocarbonates. So using this molecule is possible to immobilize on the sensor surface a compound having amine groups, for example, a protein. And in this specific case, the author used carbon disulfide to immobilize on the surface a protein called protein A. Why? Because protein A is a protein composed of 5 domains, and each domain is able to bind with good affinity the Fc region of immunoglobulins. So the protein A immobilization onto the sensor surface can allow to obtain an optimal orientation of the immunoglobulins, the bioreceptors, onto the cell surface. Because binding the immunoglobulins at the Fc tail, the FAB sites, the binding sites, are well exposed onto the sensor surface, and they are free to bind the analyte. Moreover, this immobilization is fast, low cost, and can be used. It can be performed, in my condition. The last thing to mention is that carbon disulfide layers seems to be assembled on the sensor surface, seems to be important also to reduce non-specific absorption events. Okay, this example is quite old. It was proposed about 20 years ago, but I think that it's interesting because it's a classical example of functionalization based on the formation of a self-assembled monolayer. Indeed, self-assembled monolayer, SAM, have been widely used in literature to realize a plasmonic biosensor and to give antifouling properties to the sensor surface. What is a SAM? A self-assembled monolayer is a highly ordered monolayer of close packed amphiphilic molecules. In this case, the authors used two kinds of long chain molecules to form this monolayer. Anyway, these two molecules have common features, common characteristics. In particular, they have a thiol group that allow the coupling to the gold surface. A hydrophobic alkane chain is useful to obtain a close and ordered packaging of the monolayer, and a terminal hydrophilic oligoethylene glycol chain that allows to form an hydration layer on the sensor surface. So the anti-fouling properties of this SAM are due to the high terminal hydration and to the high packing density of this monolayer. Indeed, this kind of SAM can be considered a sort of physical and energetic barrier that hampers the biomolecule specific absorption onto the sensor surface. Moreover, another important thing is that this mixed SAM can be promptly modified with bioreceptors because of the presence of carboxylic groups onto the SAM surfaces. Indeed, the carboxylic groups can react with amine groups of the bioreceptor to form amide bond. This is not a spontaneous reaction, of course. Anyway, carboxylic groups can be easily activated, for example, using carbodiimide compounds, in order to promote this coupling, this conjugation between the carboxylic group of the SAM and the amine groups of the bioreceptor. And this strategy is really noted and really exploited for biofunctionalization purposes. More recently, also peptides have been used to realize anti-fouling SAM for biosensing. And this example is really appealing because the authors used only a linear peptide to realize a biosensor able to specifically bind the target of interest, and but showing also anti-fouling properties. And this is possible because of the particular composition of this peptide. So briefly, this peptide is composed of a binding sequence showing high affinity toward the analyte, in this case the human norovirus. Then its deuterionic sequence composed by a repetition of charged amino acids, in particular lysine and glutamic acid, and this sequence is a charge balance system that form an hydration layer on the sensor surface, preventing non-specific absorption. The last part of the peptide is a flexible linker with a terminal cysteine in order to allow the SAM formation onto the gold surface. Indeed, cysteine is an amino acid characterized by the presence of a thiol group, so it can bind gold efficiently. So this is a fast, smart, and one-step strategy that allows to realize an anti-fouling biosensing surface, simply incubating a solution of this peptide onto the gold surface of the sensors. Another example with a zwitterionic peptide used to form an antifouling SIM. But in this case, an aptamer is used as bioreceptor. Moreover, in this case, we have also a third biomolecule, a protein called streptavidin, that is used as linker to conjugate the other two bioelements. This kind of functionalization is a multi-step strategy. And first of all, we have the formation of an antifouling SAM using the zwitterionic peptide. This SAM is partly biotinylated. That means that molecules of biotin are exposed on the SAM surface. The biotin presence is essential to link the streptavidin protein to the SAM surface. Indeed, streptavidin has 4 subunits able to bind biotin with an extremely high affinity. So, after the mobilization of streptavidin onto the SAM surface, the last step is the use of a biotinylated aptamer to complete this biofunctionalization. And in this way, streptavidin is able to bind both the biotinylated peptide and the biotinylated aptamer, allowing the proper orientation of the bioreceptor onto the SAM surface, onto the antifouling surface. This multi-step strategy was used with success to develop a high-sensitive biosensor for an infection marker. And the antifouling properties of this biosensor allowed a good detection of this marker also in complex real metrics as diluted serum. So this is the last example, the last example proposed, and of course is the most awesome example ever because it was proposed by my team. Now I'm joking, but I think that it's an interesting example because in this work we use phages as bioreceptor, and this is a quite innovative and performing solution for the detection of bacteria. In particular, this functionalization strategy exploits small molecules, the 4-amino-thiophenol for ATP, as linker for the phage immobilization onto the gold surface. Indeed, this molecule is able to bind gold because of the presence of a thiol group. But this molecule has also an amine group that can be exploited for the phage immobilization. In particular, a diazo-coupling chemistry was employed for this coupling. To be honest, this coupling strategy is usually not adopted for biofunctionalization. But in this case, it is particularly useful because we used this kind of biosensor to perform SERS analysis. Indeed, after the diazo bond formation, it's possible to note the presence of a typical peak at 1322 with numbers. And this typical peak is related to the vibrational stretching of the diazo bond. So this peak is a very important SERS marker that can be related to the specific bacteriophage interaction and so to the biorecognition event. In particular, the specific biorecognition events occurring on the sensor surface is detectable because it results in the intensity enhancement amplification of the peak. Moreover, these particular biofunctionalization strategies allowed us to specifically detect the Brucella bacterium also in a complex matrix as milk. So as promised, this was the last examples. And this is my beautiful team, and so I thank you all for your kind attention.